You're on the record with Brian Lewis, President of the Trinidad and Tobago Olympic Committee. Brian, earlier this year, the TTOC had its elections. You used to be the General Secretary, which had no term limits. You gave up the post to run for the presidency successfully, but at the time there were some questions, the normal shop talk, the normal questions about, can this man do it? And I know that within the community, within the organization, they had a strategic plan which identified that the next president should be someone who is networked with high net worth individual as well as people who are in the business community. And one such individual, Mr. Richard Young, the retired managing director of Scotiabank and former head of the Bankers Association, was your main contender. Were you scared? Were you worried?
No, not really. I mean, I had tremendous respect for Richard Young. I believe that he's a person of high integrity, a tremendous patriot, and I think that he would have made a tremendous president. Coming from the back of the contribution of presidents such as Larry Romani, Douglas Camacho, Alexander B. Chapman before him, Nolly Henderson, Commodore Melvin Williams. The Olympic Committee has had a significant and tremendous caliber of people who have held the office of president, so that it didn't, the reality was that it was a position that was held in a lot of high esteem, and that it required in people's minds certain attributes and characteristics. And, we went through the strategic process, and there were, that area, there was a fundamental, or the better word would be a philosophical difference. And, right. It's a democracy. Right. So we agreed to disagree. We meaning the people who would have, my colleagues and friends on the Olympic Committee at the time.
They were saying that they wanted this kind of person to lead. You were saying that it's not really a person, it's a process. You're saying it's a process of, we need to get funding into this thing. It's not so much that one person could go and get this funding from his friends. I'm paraphrasing here. You didn't actually physically say it, but this is essentially the message you were saying.
No, what I was really saying was that I felt that that approach, we had it since for about 17 years. After the Alex Chapman era, you had Douglas Camacho, who was a very successful corporate person. You had Larry Romani, who was a very successful businessman. So that sort of approach, but to be fair, they both had a significant sport background.
Right.
Mr. Young too is a sports enthusiast. But I just believed that we needed to take a different approach in the whole question of revenue and asset building, and I felt that we needed to have essentially what I call a marketing transformation in terms of how we approached the development of the sports industry and sports sector overall. That it wasn't really, to my mind, solely about the Olympic Committee's raising its own funds, but the Olympic Committee contributing and working and being a catalyst even of the transformation of the sports sector here in Trinidad and Tobago. So that was essentially, from that aspect, what it was about. Added to that, the reality was that I had significant Olympic experience, and so that I don't think that it was in any way or to have been any doubts about my understanding of the Olympic movement, right, and my capacity. There was never any questions about my capacity.
You were in this game for quite some time.
17 years before. But as I said, it was a democratic process, and I think it was fantastic because it also showed, I think, many people that you can have a contested elections and not degenerate into unethical and the personal mudslinging and that type of thing. And I think in that regard, the 2013 Trinidad and Tobago Olympic Committee elections would have set a standard. And I think that is only fair because many people look to the Trinidad and Tobago Olympic Committee as being the premier sport organization by virtue of the fact that it is responsible for the Olympic Games, the Commonwealth Games, the Pan American Games, and the Central American Games, Youth Olympic Games, and Youth Commonwealth Games. So I think that was important.
When you look at, in terms of the funding of the organization, how much of that funding comes through ministry? How much of that funding, in terms of a proportion, comes through private contributions from private enterprise, corporate sponsors, etc.?
The reality is that the Trinidad and Tobago Olympic Committee does not get funding from the ministry for any of its administration needs, any of its programs. What we do is that when we have games coming up, we would apply to the government for a subvention to assist in the travel and accommodation. And in 2012, we did approach the government for support for a training camp. And they did that, and it was tremendously successful. So that outside of games, the Trinidad and Tobago Olympic Committee funds its own funding. It comes from a combination of some tremendously supportive corporate partners, like the BPTT, Lisa Communications. We also had in years, and we're in the process of completing that negotiation, partnership or sponsorship with Adidas. During the games period, we would get support from like TSTT, Caribbean Airlines.
So you have some good marketing partners.
Well, as I said, that's what we built on, and we are in the process now of.
But in terms of a proportion, though, what do you see right now?
No, well, what I'm saying is that we don't depend on government for funding for administration, so that's zero. Mm-hmm. As I said, the government supports in terms of when we go to game, so that they would, if the government, like for next year's Commonwealth Games and Central American and Caribbean Games and Youth Olympic Games, we would have put in a subvention, and it's public record that the cabinet has approved the sum of
that's our next question. It may be not so public as all of that, but you can answer that question. That's a question for the ministry. We're still on the record. We want to come right back at you. Don't forget the phone lines are open, 225-9476. Call and find out what's going on. We'll be right back.